All right, you're live.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Chair Gwen Whistler, and I'd like to welcome you to the April 12th Planning and Economic Development Committee meeting. All council members and staff are participating virtually. To help our audience follow along, I'll state each section of the agenda aloud. We are streaming live on our Virtual Engagement Hub, which is accessible through the Virtual Engagement Hub link on the front page of the city website. We also have an option for the public to listen live by phone by dialing 855-925-2801 and entering the code 8187. For those of us out there today, welcome. For today's meeting, we do have the option for people to call in and comment live during the meeting. To call in and comment live, use the same number, 855-925-2801, meeting code 8187. Your phone line will be muted and you will hear the meeting live. At this point, callers will hear, for more options, please press star. By pressing *3, that will allow callers to continue to listen live and join the speaker queue. If you are watching the meeting through the live stream while you are listening to the meeting by phone, please be sure to turn down the volume on your device before speaking. Okay, I will ask all those participating in public comment to follow the council's rules of decorum. And those rules include the following. Speakers are only allowed to speak one time during the public comment period for each agenda item. Speakers should not expect council members or city staff to respond to the speaker's comments during their 3 minutes. Each caller is allotted 3 minutes to speak on an agenda item. In general, each agenda item will have up to a total of 1 hour for public comment. Speaker substitutions are not allowed, and a caller may not share or relinquish any remaining time they have not used to another caller. Speakers will refrain from personal attacks and/or threats directed toward council or city staff. Speakers shall be civil and courteous in their language. Insults, profanity, and any other use of vulgar language is not allowed. If a speaker uses vulgar language or starts personally attacking or threatening a council member or staff member, your microphone will be promptly muted and your speaking session will end. We appreciate your following those rules. Roll call. I'll now go through and introduce the committee members and staff who are participating virtually. Please make sure to keep your microphone muted if you are not speaking. Okay, so council and staff, as I call your name, please say a quick hello. Councilwoman Sandra Kilgore.
Hello.
Councilwoman Sage Turner.
Good afternoon.
I believe Assistant City Manager Kathy Ball will join us later. City Attorney Brad Branham.
Hello, everyone.
Planning and Urban Designer Director Todd Okolachaney.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Principal Planner Shannon Tuck.
Good afternoon.
Development Services Director Ben Woody.
Hello and good afternoon.
Site Planning Division Manager Chris Collins.
Hello.
Great. So I'm going to go ahead and start the agenda. The first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. May I get a motion to approve the March minutes?
So moved.
I'll second.
Okay, great. So now I'll go through roll call. When I say your name, please say aye or nay to approve the minutes. Councilwoman Kilgore?
Aye.
Councilwoman Turner?
Aye.
And myself, an aye. The minutes have been approved. The only item on our agenda today is the revisions to the Homestay ordinance. We'll have the revisions to the zoning text amendment regarding homestays. Shannon Tuck will start us off on this item. And at the end, after council has asked questions, we're going to open it up to public comment on this item. So with that, I'm going to ask Shannon to kick us off.
Thank you, Chair Whistler. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to get a presentation started here. I'd like to remind folks that when I share a presentation, I can't see your faces. So if you need me to pause and you have a clarifying question or something that you need to ask, please audibly speak up so that I can pause because, again, I can't see your faces or see any hands raised. So we're going to talk this afternoon about homestays. Staff actually spoke before the PED back in March. And at that time, we presented on a proposed text amendment. The text amendment to the Unified Development Ordinance specifically was to update a number of the rules and regulations for homestays. And we had a number of revisions, most, I would say the majority of which were minor in nature and weren't substantive. But we had three, what I would say are significant changes. The first of those three was a prohibition on the use of detached accessory structures as homestays. And the PED back in March gave us clear direction on that. So we're setting aside that particular point for today's discussion. And we're going to focus primarily on the two items for which there was a fair amount of discussion, but not clear direction offered back in March. So we're back here today with a little bit more analysis for the PED's consideration in an effort to try to get more specific and clear feedback and direction as to which way we should go with these two remaining items. So those two items include kitchens and whether we should allow kitchens in homestays, and whether or not we should include property owners who do not reside on the property that has a homestay as an applicant, a co-applicant or co-host for a homestay. And I'm going to talk about these both a little bit more specifically. But before I do that, for those folks who might be joining us new this afternoon, I wanted to just pause briefly to talk about the background for homestays. So homestay standards have been in place at least since 2006, but the vision of a homestay has kind of evolved. So back in 2006, we really envisioned them to be more like mini bed and breakfasts. And in fact, the definition included the serving of a meal. As an example. So
Shannon, do you know you're not sharing the presentation?
Oh, I don't. I'm sorry. Thank you for saying
Yeah, you're
so.
welcome.
Let me go back. You didn't miss much. So thank you for letting me know. Okay, can you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Okay, so just to back up, what we're considering today, those two items, whether or not to allow kitchens in homestays and whether or not property owners who don't reside on the property to be co-applicants. And then this was the slide that I was on when Jenna let me know that the presentation wasn't being shared. So this is the background slide. So I was talking about how the vision for homestays has evolved over the years. They were originally visioned to be more like mini bed and breakfasts. And then with the popularity and interest in renting spaces as homestays grew, the city relaxed the rules and requirements for homestays significantly as interest and availability of those online platforms expanded. So in 2015, after we adopted these rules, or these updates to the rules, we significantly broadened properties that could be eligible for homestays. And as a result, we had a little bit of a boom of homestay permits being issued. Those standards for homestays were further refined in 2018 as part of a broader ordinance that was related to multiple forms of lodging. And it was at this time in 2018 that we added a definition for kitchen. I'm going to talk about kitchen more specifically here in a moment. So again, today we're seeking direction on some additional changes to address enforcement concerns and also some community concerns and questions regarding kitchens. So before I get into the two changes, I would like to take a moment just to sort of talk about the difference between a dwelling unit and a homestay, because to understand our homestay regulations and the relationship between dwelling units and homestays, it's important to kind of really understand this distinction. Now, the definitions that I have on the screen are not the UDO definitions, and I believe that it's those definitions that may be contributing to some of the confusion because they're very technical in nature, and while they're true and accurate, I think they're a little bit hard for people who are not accustomed to land use law to kind of understand. So I've tried to kind of put them in simpler terms here. So a dwelling unit really is just a series of rooms that are designed for independent long-term living. And what we mean by independent long-term living is we're talking about housing. It's just housing. And that housing would include separate bathroom, bedroom, and a kitchen. Those are the three elements that are required to support long-term living. Now, this is different than a homestay. A homestay is not a building. It is not a dwelling unit. It is not even rooms within a dwelling unit. It's actually a use. It's a land use. It's an activity that occurs within a dwelling unit. And that activity can occupy up to 2 guest rooms that are used to provide short-term or overnight lodging accommodations for compensation. Now, this next point's really pretty important. A homestay is secondary to the main residential use of the home, and the dwelling must be occupied by a full-time, long-term resident. So first and foremost, a dwelling unit is for housing. So somebody must live there on a permanent and full-time basis. And secondarily, it can be used as a homestay, or some part of it can be can support a homestay activity or homestay use. So moving on, we have those 2 items that we're seeking clarification on. The first amendment would be to clarify the definition of kitchen. But before we can do that, we need policy direction on whether or not we should allow sinks or any of the other kitchen features in a homestay. And we think that there are basically 3 options. And so we've taken the 3 options and we've kind of tried to boil them down into these sort of bulleted pros and cons, or benefits and drawbacks. So the first option is to allow a sink and a refrigerator, but no stove. This is essentially the pre-2018 interpretation. So before 2018, we didn't have a definition of kitchen, and this is the standard that we followed. The second is to allow, or is to not allow any of the major elements. So in addition to not allowing a stove, we don't allow a sink or refrigerator, full-size refrigerator. So this is actually the standard that we follow today. So the first one is pre-2018. The second one is 2018 to present day. And then the third option is one that we are proposing as an alternative, which is to simply allow a full kitchen. So going back to the first item, to allow a sink and a refrigerator, but no stove. Again, that was that pre-2018 definition. And before it wasn't a definition, interpretation. Before 2018, we didn't have a definition. And we relied on just sort of a common Webster's dictionary kind of definition, which just says a kitchen is a room that's used for the preparation and cooking of food. So if you can't cook the food, it's not a kitchen. So that's where the practice of removing a stove came from. If you remove a stove, you are effectively deconstructing that space from a kitchen into something else. And if you don't have a kitchen, you don't have a dwelling unit. And so that space now becomes eligible for a homestay. The benefits of this option is that it allows some amenities for lodgers. So you've got a sink, you've got a refrigerator, maybe you have some other plug-in appliances. And it's consistent with that former interpretation, that pre-2018 interpretation. So there is already some community understanding and acceptance of this option. Now, the negatives to this particular option is that it is somewhat difficult to enforce. We did have individuals who, as soon as they took the stove out, they got their permit, and as soon as we turned our back, they slid the stove back in. And it's really difficult to track that, and it's very difficult to catch that. It's also not a particularly effective. You can remove the stove and say, oh, you can't cook, but people would just replace the stove with a microwave, a hot plate, and other sort of plug-in countertop appliances, such as, those little convection toaster ovens. So, you're not cooking maybe a large sort of Thanksgiving meal, but there are certain, appliances available to warm up food. The second option to is to not allow any of the major kitchen elements. Now, I mentioned already that this is basically the standard that we follow today. The benefits to this option is that it may slow or deter the conversion of existing living spaces that are currently being used or could be used for housing. And that is actually one of the reasons we moved from that pre-2018 interpretation to adopting a definition of kitchen that said you shouldn't have any of these spaces, or if that you did, it was a kitchen and was therefore problematic. Is because we saw spaces that had been used for long-term housing being converted for homestays, so for short-term use as opposed to long-term. So this was something of a concern. So this is one of the reasons we moved in this direction with that definition. Another pro is that it's consistent with the limits on other forms of lodging, such as a standard hotel room. It's certainly easier to enforce. It's much easier to just say you can't have any of these things than to say, well, you can have these two things, but not that one. And, it just gets a little murky. And it also helps to clarify the distinction between a homestay and a dwelling unit. So this is the most clear option where, by not having any of these major features or amenities, it's clear that it's not a kitchen and therefore it's not a dwelling unit. Now, the negatives of this is that it doesn't allow flexibility to move between short and long-term renting and could discourage investment in those spaces that could be used for long-term housing in the future. So this is something that we saw in the pandemic, that spaces that had been used as homestays could easily then become long-term housing when the demand for short-term renting kind of was less, and then go back to being homestays again in the future when there was less demand. It also limits the amenities and attractiveness of the homestay, so it's perhaps not as competitive in the larger lodging marketplace.
Shannon, may I ask you a question? This is Sage.
Sure.
So when you say that the flexibility between short and long-term rental, we talked about this a little bit last time in that, sure, if the homestay were a separate unit and didn't have a kitchen, it wouldn't transition to long-term rental. But the simple fact that the remainder of the house by rule should have a major kitchen means that the homestay without a kitchen could still be a long-term rental to a roommate or a housemate immediately. It doesn't, like the house has a kitchen, the homestay having a separate kitchen does not, right? Am I following that right?
Correct. I suppose we're imagining two separate spaces, so two separate rentals.
But a house with a family and a homestay could still be a long-term rental without a second kitchen in it, just to clarify.
Correct. But you're sharing a kitchen, which would not be, I guess, as desirable for a lot of folks.
Right. I mean, I think, it's sort of it just adds independence, right? I mean, the situation Sage is referring to is, sort of more perceived as a roommate situation, right, as opposed to a little more independent. So,
right. Two families or something. Correct.
Right.
Just wanted some clarity. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So I'll move on to the third option now, which is to allow a full kitchen. So while the first option is the most difficult to enforce, the second option is a little bit easier to enforce. This third option, actually, no enforcement really is needed. It's the easiest one. It's allowed and we don't have to worry about it. It also allows the maximum flexibility to move between long and short-term renting. And it provides the greatest amenity to guests. So it would make those homestays in Asheville more attractive and competitive. The negatives is that it definitely blurs the distinction between a homestay and dwelling unit. And in fact, if you are a separate space that has a kitchen and a bathroom and a sleeping room, you are a dwelling unit. It may not be a dwelling unit under the building code, but it would have all of the features necessary to support long-term living or housing. It may also encourage the use of accessory living spaces to be used for resident housing and for the principal dwelling to be rented to guests. So I'm going to pause here for a little bit because that might take a little more explaining. So the typical model is, imagine a 3-bedroom house It's your principal dwelling. And maybe you have a daylighted basement that is a sort of a homestay suite. So that's sort of the typical model under today's rules. If we allow a full kitchen in that suite, in that homestay suite, it makes it easier for the resident, the permanent resident of the property, to occupy that subordinate homestay space or what was the homestay space, and then rent the principal dwelling to the guests. So it kind of flips the model. Now, I should also clarify, this happens today. So even though we don't allow homestays to have kitchens, we have instances where a tenant or a resident manager of that homestay, instead of living in the main house and renting the subordinate space, they actually occupy the subordinate space and rent the main house. So that happens today. Now, I wouldn't say it's widespread, but it's not uncommon. So if we allow kitchens, I guess what this con is trying to say is that it might make that easier, and we might see that more. And that might not be a good thing.
But Shannon, I thought do we have anything that would prevent that?
Not under today's rules. Now, we could maybe consider, something that said, well, I'm not sure. There may be a standard that we could consider that would kind of help control for that, but we haven't ever gotten there.
May I ask a clarifying question? This is Sage.
Sure.
Because I'm not sure I understand, because we don't allow the homestays in separate dwellings. So maybe it's the language of the primary dwelling and the secondary dwelling that is throwing me when you say this, because we don't really there's not a secondary dwelling that the resident is moving out of, right? It's still all just one house.
Right.
Or just rooms in a house.
It's one house. So let's go back to that model. So you've got your main principal dwelling, sort of say it's a 2-story house and you've got 3 bedrooms. Then you've got that lower level daylighted basement suite. So today's model would encourage the resident, the permanent resident of the property, to occupy the main house and homestay out that lower suite. And that's the suite that doesn't have the kitchen. But we do have instances where the resident of the property doesn't occupy the main house. They actually kind of live in that suite and then rent the main house with the living room and the full kitchen and all of that to the guests. And there's nothing in our rules today that would prevent that. So what we're trying to say here is that if we allowed a kitchen in that suite, it now makes it easier for people to do that, for that practice to continue or even grow. Because, while I said that it's not uncommon, but it's not widespread. So if it could just be sort of tempting to just sort of occupy that subordinate space or live in that subordinate space, but then rent that principal space to out-of-town guests. I hope that's clear.
So in other words, what you're saying, Shannon, is that would open up full house rentals in Asheville, basically.
Right. Yeah. It would look and feel more like a short-term vacation rental.
Yeah.
Because the main house would be occupied. Now, there's another issue with that, in that there's nothing to prevent a 4-bedroom house from being used as a homestay, even though we only allow 2 bedrooms to be rented on a short-term basis. So when you kind of flip that model and you have that 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom house, whatever, being rented, we can make sure that the listing limits the number of bedrooms being rented to no more than 2. But you can't really effectively control who's sleeping in those bedrooms, So they're, it's just a tricky thing to monitor and manage. And then the last con associated with this option is that it could increase the conversion of long-term living spaces into homestays. So there are those individuals who have these sort of subordinate living spaces that have the kitchen, and they don't rent short-term because they have the kitchen and they don't want to take out the sink and they don't want to take out the stove and they just don't want to mess with it. So they're like, we'll just keep renting it long-term. Well, if we now open up that option, it could increase the number of conversions and potentially displace people. So those are the options associated with the kitchens with homestays. And I'm going to move on to the second amendment if there aren't any more clarifying questions. And then we can certainly come back and discuss these different aspects in more detail. So the second change that we were considering was whether or not we should require a property owner who doesn't live on the property. So this is somebody who has a house somewhere else, but they have this extra property and they don't live there. And they have a tenant who manages and hosts a homestay. So we're considering allowing or requiring rather that property owner to be a co-host or a co-applicant on that homestay application. And this is a little bit more straightforward. I think we have basically two options. One is to kind of keep the status quo where the resident or that tenant is the only host and the only one responsible for managing and running that homestay. Now, the original vision behind this was that it would empower renters to have that homestay and they could build wealth and potentially improve their housing security. But the negative of it is that it puts all of the responsibility on the tenant. It's more difficult to enforce, and owners are finding ways to work around the restriction. And they end up participating in managing or running the homestay, or they benefit financially in some other way despite the prohibition. And it does not prevent property investors from buying multiple properties and installing a resident manager in each. So imagine an out-of-town investor buys 6 homes in Asheville, and they work out with 6 different individuals to be the tenant or resident manager of that homestay. And, they either do that workaround and find ways to manage the homestays themselves and benefit, or one of the more common moves or ways that a property owner could potentially benefit is that if a tenant comes to them and says, I want to do a homestay, will you support me? They say yes, but I'm going to charge you more rent. So in that way, they're totally following the ordinance because they're not managing that homestay or they're not participating in that. The tenant is doing that, but they're still benefiting financially. So that's basically how we do it today, or that's the option, that's the status quo option. The other option is to require property owners who are not living on the property to be that co-host or that co-applicant, along with the tenant. So both the tenant and the property owner would be applicants and hosts. What this does is it allows owners and tenants to work out whatever mutually beneficial arrangement works for them. And it kind of shares the responsibility. So not all of the responsibilities on the tenant. It allows the tracking that's necessary to limit investors to one homestay permit, despite the number of properties they may own. So what we are imagining is that on the application, we would ask, for all of the owners to be identified on the application. And if it's an LLC or a trust or a corporation, we would ask for them to list who has an ownership interest in that, say, LLC. And then this also would reduce the amount of enforcement needed. Right now, we're having to kind of figure out, it's sometimes, Mary Smith is the permit holder or the tenant resident manager. But then when you look at all of the review comments, they talk about speaking with Jane, White, who's the property owner. And we realize that Jane is sort of in the mix there, and we have to kind of get an enforcement. So this would eliminate the need for that. Now, the only con that we potentially identified is that, there could be instances, we suppose, where it might be difficult to identify that ownership. People may not be forthright with the information, and then we go to check it or verify it against the Secretary of State or other public records. And there may be ways to kind of hide it, and, we're not really sure. But we feel fairly confident that the majority of permit holders and applicants are honest on their applications and, won't be evasive in this way. So we feel fairly good about that. And we do feel like we're within our legal right to do so. We already limit homestay permits to 1 per property and 1 per owner, per person. It's just that the property owner isn't that person. So by making them an applicant, we're able to track it. So that's kind of the thinking behind it. And we're not getting in. We're not interfering with ownership or regulating ownership because they can continue to own as many properties as they like. We're only regulating how many homestay permits they're allowed to have. And so if after today, we hope to get the feedback and direction that we need on these two options, and then we can incorporate that feedback into the proposed zoning text amendment that can then move on to the full council for their consideration. That concludes my summary. I'd be happy to back up and answer any questions that the committee members may have.
Councilwoman Kilgore, do you have questions or you want?
Well, I don't really have any questions. I was just going to comment on the option that she was just speaking of about the investor type. Yes, this one here, and basically, I am very much in favor of requiring the property owners not living on the property be a co-host. I think this will be a great way to keep track of it. And also what I really feel that even if we have problems, I think that if we start putting in place stricter penalties for people that basically violate these rules and regulations, then that would put a stop to a lot of it. But I do like that option for that particular item. Do you want me to say what the option on the other one?
No, I mean,
okay.
Why don't we, before we, sort of weigh in on where we are, we will open it up to public comment. So
okay, thank you.
So that we get input before we sort of put our stake in the sand or whatever that expression is.
Thank you.
Anything else, Sandra? Okay. Councilwoman Turner, do you have any other questions or comments?
I'm curious, Shannon. I have some broader questions, but about the presentation itself, do we have 4 and 5 bedroom houses that are homestays permitted, but then renting 5 bedrooms? Is that an enforcement issue you run into?
We've had that.
It's rare, right?
I think it's usually a not understanding the rules when that happens. And then we quickly jump on it. They quickly change their listing. Gotcha. But, sometimes you have these listings that will be 2 bedrooms can sleep 12, so we have to kind of dig a little bit further into that.
It's like, boy, you better be good friends.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, so I guess the last slide that you were just talking about is very interesting. I appreciate it. And great job in all of the presentation. I will say, I know you all have worked very hard on this for a very long time. So when I see that property managers are managing several of these in the city, does that mean that there is some unpermitted activity happening? They're not supposed to be doing that? Like we heard from some property managers that are like, I have 11 and I manage them for other families.
So I guess I'm not really sure. There are a few different scenarios that can happen there when you have an actual property manager. There are some managers who manage a lot of monthly rentals. There are some who do the downtown short-term vacation rentals that were grandfathered. Right. And then there are others who I think this is probably what you're imagining more or referring to more, where they try to assist folks like with the bookings or communication, and that they're not supposed to be doing that. So whoever the full-time permanent resident of the property is, that is the person who's supposed to be responsible for managing and operating that homestay. Now, how you interpret, manage, and operate a homestay can kind of vary, and getting some professional assistance in some cases, could be acceptable. I think it's just very much a case-by-case basis.
And similar, akin to, not every homestay user cleans it themselves. So there are certainly some services being outsourced and stuff. The management through me. So in this I guess not new, but what you just presented might actually prevent some of those property managers from doing that, right? I guess that's the co-hosting thing you're referring to?
Yes.
I just want to make sure I understand. Okay.
Right. But the way we were envisioning is that, so the most common scenario is that you have a tenant and the property owner is the one who's kind of helping. These property managers are a little bit different. If that's something we want to allow, then I think we have to think about that a little bit more, because what we were envisioning was requiring the owners to be listed as applicants along with the tenant and not having a property manager. If that's something we don't want to allow, then we might need to.
No, I think you're in the same gray area that I am, so I'll just keep thinking about it. Thank you.
Yeah. I would think also what you were just saying, that did bring up a point, because basically with the property managers, they have to be licensed in order to handle these properties for these owners. So I think that's something we definitely need to look into, because that really wouldn't be a homestay if it's, managed by a real estate management company. It does. It's actually.
It definitely feels more like a commercial enterprise.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it wouldn't be, just a homestay.
And Sandra, Councilman Kilgore, you're an agent, so so you have to be licensed to manage
property for others for a fee. So
thank you. Didn't mean to derail us.
Okay.
And Shannon, I'm just going to ask a question on the point around kitchens, etc. That you said it. Somebody could live in the subordinate area, or the for lack of a better expression,
is what I call
it. One, is that a big concern? And two, have we thought about a way to tackle that one?
I think it kind of depends on your perspective, whether you think that that's a concern or not. We do get complaints where people think it's being rented, like it's a whole house, short-term vacation rental, and we go to investigate, and it kind of like on the surface looks like that, because the guests are in that, kind of that main dwelling space. But when we really look and investigate, we realize, the homestay operator or that resident is actually living in that kind of subordinate space. And so it kind of looks like to the neighbors that it's a whole house short-term vacation rental, but really there is somebody living there. So it is housing. It's still being used as housing. So it just, in some cases, they're like, this might be more than the 2 bedrooms that a homestay would normally support, or that a homestay would normally be allowed. So it might be a 3-bedroom house, a 4-bedroom house, of which only 2 bedrooms are being used, which, I think some people would feel like that's not the best use of the housing that we have. But others would think that it's just a lot of good flexibility that kind of, meets people where the need is.
Well, I mean, one of my big concerns around this whole issue is, there needs to be somebody on site, close by to, for lack of a better term, protect the neighborhood from inappropriate behavior of short-term rental guests. And so I don't know. I mean, there's part of me that's a little concerned about this idea of, the bigger space gets rented out, but I'm not sure I know why. It kind of bugs me. So, but maybe some of our public comment people can help us think about that.
Well, I appreciate that comment, because I'm also, like you said, protecting the neighborhood, but also maintaining it as a neighborhood. Like if you don't have the renter or the owner there, you're losing.
Well, they have to be there.
Right. They would be there.
Right.
They're just, okay.
I'm just saying it's also a measure of, do we have a neighborhood or do we have a visiting street, So I think I agree with you, Gwen. I just want to, so I will have some questions at the end. I'm happy to go to public comment and then ask them. I just don't know if it's better for me to ask them now or after public comment. I'll look to you, Chair.
Why don't you go ahead and ask Councilwoman?
Well, I guess what we were just talking about.
I hope that based on your comments, that we're indicating that we are still open-minded relative to getting input from our neighbors. Okay.
Yes.
So I just would ask that.
I appreciate that. I guess, so in light of what we were just saying, I'm wondering, like in the history of this, because it sounds like it's been going on for several years, have we done any other community input? Are we in a vacuum of just the homestayers, or did neighborhoods weigh in on this? Or, because this is kind of an expansion of something in neighborhoods, but I don't know if we ever.
Well, this is something that's been going on for quite some time. You may recall that back in March in my presentation, I mentioned that we had actually been before the PED back in 2019. And this was after the 2018 amendment that established that no kitchens could be allowed in a homestay, which included no sinks. The initial pushback was, we need to at least have sinks. And so there was a push to kind of change that kitchen definition to be more reflective of that pre-2018 interpretation. And that was discussed, and there was direction from the PED back in 2019, but the whole effort got kind of put on hold for a little while, and then the pandemic occurred. So during this hiatus, we've sat down and kind of discussed this with the Homestay Network representatives to kind of talk about what are our goals, what are their goals, and, see if there's some common ground. And that's kind of what this particular amendment is sort of coming out of. But it comes out of that 2019 pushback. And at that time, there was a lot of community feedback. So there was a lot of input from the neighborhoods and others, but it has been relatively quiet over these last couple of years.
Well, and we know that engagement has been hard during the pandemic. So I guess maybe we could find that information. I would be curious to see it, the community input on expansion of homestays or short-term rentals in their neighborhoods. Like if CAN weighed in or anything, I'm just curious.
Oh, I don't recall that there was like a specific
neighborhood input.
Yeah, I don't think it was anything like that. I think it was like sort of, we were on the CAN agenda and we shared the update. And, there may have been some emails that came after that were sent to all the council members and, stuff like that. But it wasn't like we had a big forum or anything.
Well, if there's anything you can forward to us between now and council, that would be helpful. And maybe I can reach out to CAN. I'm just curious. And then, another question is, and I don't know if we'll know this, do we know if we still currently have the largest percentage of housing stock being used as short-term rentals in the United States, Asheville City proper? In 2018, we were identified as the largest in the United States. But I don't know if that is still the case.
That's not a statistic I'm familiar with, so I would defer to Chris or Ben. They may know a little bit more about that.
I haven't heard anything specifically about that of late.
Okay.
There's certainly probably some math we could do with trying to figure out what percentage of housing units and things like that, but probably not on the fly.
Yeah, I think the article had said 3%. It was the single largest in the United States. That was the article. It's still in the Citizen Time if you can find it.
Okay.
Maybe we can just come back. Maybe these are just questions to drum up more information for council rather than us feeling like we need to answer them right now. Because my other ones are really around enforcement. And because we received some emails around enforcement being a real problem. And if there's anything we all could agree on in all those emails, it sounded like enforcement might be one of them, and that people are really troubled by the lack thereof. I did receive some emails that were down enforcement staff, and one specifically that said we have like 115 known illegal units that we're not enforcing. Can anybody speak to that, or if that's even true? It said that city staff told them that, so I just don't know if that's in a report somewhere.
I haven't heard the number 115 that are not being enforced. Typically when we do get a complaint or something, we follow up on it, but we have a very small zoning enforcement.
That was also from the Homestay Network, one of the people that said that. So we may need to look into that. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's not accurate. And then I guess I'm wondering too, do we know how many we have? Will you be able to bring that to us? I'm not asking you to right now. Will you be able to bring that to
Well,
us?
I mean, Sage, you're asking, I mean, just to clarify, you're asking them to identify how many illegal we have?
No. Permitted. I just don't know.
Oh, well, they know
Yeah,
that.
we definitely know how many have been permitted.
Okay, I would love to have that information. I got some emails with different numbers. I just don't know. And then that might be all of my current. Oh, I did want to speak to this for the folks listening that had some concerns. I did hear from several people that thought if the ordinance changed, that they would lose their homestay despite already being permitted. Maybe someone could speak to grandfathering or what happens if an ordinance changes. That would be helpful.
So regarding the change, it kind of depends on what the change is. If I'm trying to think of so right now the kitchen is the most restrictive option. So I wouldn't think that would happen. But and then also what we're talking about with the change with property ownership or a property owner being a co-applicant, that's actually more permissive as well. So I don't think these particular changes should result in people losing their homestay permits. Anybody who was grandfathered under that 2018 rule, they continue to operate that way. So here's an example, I suppose, where this could happen is if you're a property investor and you've got those 6 properties, when those properties come up for renewal, you would have to list who the owners are under this rule. And so then we would start to potentially say, okay, you got unit A has a homestay in it. So the next time your other tenant comes in with a homestay permit and you're listed again, we're gonna block it. We're not going to issue that homestay permit.
And Shannon, when you said up for renewal, what is the time limit on those permits?
It's an annual.
It's annual. Okay.
Yeah, it's a yearly permit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to ask this question. You've answered it to council members before, but if we were to allow this, for the homestays to have a kitchen as, the third proposal, what's staff's opinion or that relative to, do you think it's going to increase or do you think it's going to decrease the number of long-term rentals available in the city?
So that is a tough thing to answer. It kind of requires a crystal ball. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be, I'm not being sarcastic. It's tough because on the one hand, it can encourage the conversion of existing spaces that are being used as long-term into short-term. But at the same time, it could also potentially stimulate investment in those spaces, knowing that they have that additional flexibility. So what is short-term today could be long-term tomorrow. So it's really hard to know. And there's different philosophies and different thinking on this. And I don't know that I could answer that clearly.
Anyone else have an opinion one way or the other on that?
Well, this is what I was wondering too, Shannon. Say, for instance, that you put something in place that would only allow a certain percentage of homestays in Asheville or in certain areas. So could you control it by that using those means?
So that is something, we explored that early on in the homestay regulations process. And for different reasons, we didn't go forward with it. It is a little tricky because then you have to figure out who gets the permit and who doesn't. Because if it's rolling, if it's an annual permit and there's a cap, say by census district, that was one thing that we looked at, then it has to be, your renewal period has to be the same time every year, and it has to be like a first come, first serve.
See, you know how the HOAs do when they have units, they only have, like, say, for instance, only 10% can be rented in a complex, and then they'll say, the way they roll, pretty much everybody come in for renewal, some type of process like that.
I think we're talking about the same thing.
Same thing, yeah.
But so say we have a census district or census tract that already exceeds whatever that cap is.
Okay.
And right now, everybody's coming in. It's a yearly permit. So my permit may be due in April, but somebody else's permit may be due in September.
Yeah.
So if we already exceed it, how do we know who to renew and who not when we already have a certain number?
I would say that when they roll off of it, say for instance, if someone's due in April, and at that time, if you pretty much have your quota or it's over the quota, then those are not going to be renewed. It's So
I think the challenge there is that April person might be like, why am I losing my place when I was actually in the system before the person in September? So there's a lot of fairness challenges related to a cap, and you're kind of uncovering a couple of those. So it's a little tricky. But it was something that we explored, and for different reasons, I think council members chose not to go with it.
And I'm not sure if Brad will know this. I think there was some case study or case law in the last year or so around this in North Carolina. Maybe, I think we got Kathy. Maybe I'll mute her. Maybe in over to the coast, there might have been a case about this, about a lottery or a cap. Brad may know, or we may want to know for the council meeting.
Sure, and thank you for that, Councilwoman Turner. There was a case actually in Wilmington regarding short-term rental permits, and primarily this had to deal with a system that was essentially a register of those properties that were utilizing the system, and they do employ a lottery system to determine who gets those particular permits. There was an indication by the court system that a registration system would not be legal, which essentially we are not doing here. We do a permitting system, but we don't keep a registry per se. We just do a permitting system. So it's a little bit of a different set of facts as opposed to what we do here. But that case, I would note, is also currently being appealed to the North Carolina Court of Appeals. So I don't believe that we should draw too many inferences from that yet, but certainly something that my office is keeping an eye on.
Thank you, Brad.
And I'm not sure. This is Kathy. I'm not sure if y'all can hear me. I'm sorry, I'm traveling.
Yeah, we can hear you, Kathy.
Thank you. I want to go back to Gwen's question, Councilmember Whistler. The question of whether or not being able to have a conversion of the kitchen, I want to make sure I understand it. The conversion of the kitchen would allow more homestays? Is that your question?
No, my question, I think if you're talking about my last question, what I'm asking is, do we think that this change where you would allow the homestay to have a full kitchen, do we think that will decrease the inventory of long-term rental?
I think it definitely has that potential, because I think the market is going to drive what people will or will not do with that space. So if they determine that they can make more money using it as a short-term rental, then they want that kind of lifestyle, it definitely opens them up to being able to do that. I think the interesting thing about what we're proposing is that while the kitchen definition may increase or decrease the long-term units potentially, the fact that we limit the ownership and co-host will decrease the number of units. So I think from our perspective, there was the ability to compromise and say, if people need to use that space for short term in order to supplement their revenue so they can live there, that makes sense, and that would be the reason we would choose to do it. But if they're doing it as investment properties, then that's, I think, where we were hoping to limit and decrease the number of short-term rentals that we were looking at. So I would say if you separated the two of these things that we're talking about, you could you could say one obviously is going to decrease if the other has the potential to increase short-term and decrease long-term, depending on where we are in the market. If we go through another pandemic, then it allows them to do it for long-term, and because people aren't traveling as much. So, I mean, that from my perspective, I think the market is going to control what people are willing to do in terms of whether there's more of a demand for long-term space or demand for short-term. And I would say the demand is probably there for short-term rental at this point. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, you know, it's interesting because I've read, you know, this whole conversation, especially, I think it was Seattle, you know, what they found, or allegedly what they found was, you know, people really thought the short-term rental lifestyle was going to be for them. And then they kind of, you know, set it up for that and then turned around 3 or 4 years later and said, no, you know, I don't really like all the ins and outs. I'd much prefer to have a trusted long-term rental. So, I mean, I'm not, I guess I wouldn't want to come away with this saying we know for sure that allowing a kitchen is going to decrease the availability of long-term rental. I think that I think we just don't know. But I definitely agree with you, Kathy, in the sense of, you know, only allowing one owner to have, or, you know, an owner is limited to one homestay. I think that it really addresses a big concern with our residents around this idea of, you know, people that don't live here coming in and buying up a bunch of real estate and taking it off the market. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely think that will be responsive to the community. So, go ahead, Sandra.
Only thing I was going to say too about that option, what we're not looking at too is if you did allow the kitchens, like you said, pretty much. You think about, you said, will it actually decrease long-term rentals? Not necessarily, because a lot of the people now are living extended families. They have their mother with them, their mother-in-law, their children are coming home from school. And if their children can actually stay downstairs and have a kitchen away from the mom, then that would keep them from going out, renting other units, and the same thing with other. So it may help the situation. So I can see that from both parts, but yeah, especially in light of today. And I think that people, like she said earlier, with the short-term rentals and the pandemic and the whole situation, a lot of people are getting away from that. They're really thinking more of security. So it may not be as prevalent as people think because of the conditions we find ourselves in now.
Right.
Kathy, can you still hear us? I'm wondering if Kathy's point about that is because we think we have so many that are owned by so few. And I'm wondering, I know we don't know the state, I'm just wondering if before it gets to council, if there's a way to understand that. Because to Kathy's point, if we have 10 people that run 100 and this enforcement or rule changes that, and that's where this expected decrease would come, I would love to know kind of, how many we have, if that's possible by.
Yeah. Well, because we don't know at this point, because like Shannon said earlier, they could have a different tenant in every one of those, and we don't know necessarily that the owner is the same. And if you go look at the tax information, it has a different LLC for each of those, and so you don't know the owner of the LLC. And it would be like a lot of work to be able to
figure that out. Okay.
We did look at that at one time. We did we were just curious. So what we did is we didn't try to search by owner because by the owner's name, because like Kathy said, that's tricky. And we did it by mailing address. So if you look at a property record, every LLC, every owner will have a mailing address. So we did a search to see how many duplicate mailing addresses showed up. It was just kind of a curiosity. And, we had some. It wasn't a ton. I actually, to be honest, I expected more than we found. But, there were some. But again, we weren't really using the best data we could have used to do the search.
And Shannon, and tell me something now, if we impose, because one thing I don't want to see the people in the community being affected by bad actors out here that's taking advantage of the situation. And I really, because a lot of people do need to help right now, and they do need, different things or whatever. But I think if we could actually adopt just stricter policy or penalties for these people, I think that in itself could really, it's sort of, hurt a lot of, keep a lot of people from doing it. And also it can add revenue to the city's budget to sort of, regulate these issues, because I think that's what it is. We're making it too easy for the bad actors and the other people getting hurt behind it. So is it anything that we could do maybe to, And I definitely think we definitely need to do something about it, because all the investors did was flip, from being able to buy the houses and do what they were doing. They just flipped to another way of doing it, of making money with these short-term rentals.
So a standard zoning violation for every day that you're out of compliance is $100. A short-term or lodging violation like this, a homestay or short-term rental violation, is $500. So we did make that increase some years ago. There has been discussion in the past about whether it should be even higher, or maybe we should escalate. Like your first violation is $500 a day until it's resolved. But if you do it again, it's $1,000 a day. And if you do it a third time, then you lose your permit for 3 years, something like that. So that has been bandied around. We haven't move forward with it, not having specific direction to do so. But it has something that's come up before. It's been discussed.
The other thing that Brad may speak to is I think all the fines go to the school system. So I don't think they help the city's budget. They actually are required to go to the school system.
And Kathy, I want to ask you a question. How come that's the way it's set up?
It's a state law.
It's a state law?
Yeah. I can answer that. That's actually prescribed in the North Carolina Constitution.
Okay.
Councilwoman Kilgore. So these types of fines, regardless of what city we're talking about, when collected, have to be distributed to the school system in the local region where the city or the village or town lies.
Okay. And the reason I was asking that, Brad, is because I noticed that whenever we have these discussions, all we talk about is enforcement and how expensive it is and how we only have a couple of people on staff working on it. And I'm like, is it any way that they'll be able to subsidize? It could actually make sense to subsidize what we're trying to control, that monies can go toward that. Is there, so how do you actually find the money to afford to get people to enforce, if that's the case?
It's an excellent question, and this is somewhat difficult. You are permitted to keep a very small percentage for sort of an administrative fee, but to utilize such funds for additional personnel or enforcement mechanisms over and beyond just a very basic administration is probably beyond what North Carolina law would allow. So we are, as you mentioned, highlighted, taking those funds directly out of other city budgets, generally our general fund budget, which is always going to be a limitation when there is a mass amount of potential or actual fraud going on.
That's a hard one. Councilwoman Kilgore, if I recall, the $200 permit fee may go to helping staff cover the staffing of enforcement. I think that's right. I'm curious, maybe this is just go ahead.
Well, I just want to remind everyone that, we're an hour into the meeting and we haven't started public comment. So
do we know how much public comment we have?
Staff, did we have any feel for that, Jenna?
Right now we have 11 people in the queue.
Okay. That's good. So we look like we're actually pretty good on time. I can bring up my point before the council meeting. It's okay. Let's go to public comment.
Okay, so let's go ahead and open it up to public comment. Jenna, you're in the driver's seat now.
All right, I'll bring the first caller in now and I'll let you know when we've reached the end.
Hey there, this is Michelle Smith, and I am reading comments from Sherry Torres, who can't be here today. And we are both have been involved in the Asheville Homestay Network at a steering level for several years. Dear members of the PED, the members of the Homestay Network have patiently collaborated with the city. I ask you to honor that work and pass the city's proposal. Enough is enough. The Monday, April 12th PED meeting reminds me of a meeting that was called 2 years ago about the same issue. I'm completely dismayed by City Council's actions after their encouragement for the city and the homestay community to work together to develop policies that support both healthy neighborhoods and homestay businesses. For 2 years, the city and leadership in the Homestay Network have worked together to develop reasonable rules that keep neighborhoods intact, allow homestay businesses to earn income, and to find opportunities for affordable housing within homestay businesses, and to create rules that maximize the flexibility for homestay hosts to shift back and forth from long-term to short-term as their financial needs change or the environment changes, e.g. COVID. Finally, a plan that everyone felt was fair and was created only to have it questioned by someone who perhaps did not know the history, but who was able to block the whole process again. I would have hoped that other members of the council would have stood up for the process they encouraged. I would have hoped that someone for council would have shared that the questions asked by SAGE, which have already been asked and answered within the proposed plan by the city, have already been discussed, and this plan addressed them from the city's frame. I work hard at staying open, anticipating transparency, honesty, and true collaboration between city and community. And this move on the part of council and PED makes it very hard for me not to wonder if there's an agenda on the part of some members of the council that is not being shared openly. I would like to remind council members that rules and regulations regarding long-term apartments in one's home and a short-term apartment are significantly distinct. Regulations around long-term rentals include such things as installing firewalls between your residence and the rental property, and include separate water, heat, and air, among other things. If we want our citizens to abide by the laws and the rules of the city, putting a stove in or taking it out does not make a legal long-term rental. Many people can't afford to make those changes. Not to mention, many people don't want to host a long-term rental. I am one of them. As for me, I'm lucky at the moment as I'm grandfathered in, so I've not had to rip out sinks, throw out perfectly good refrigerators, or buy a small one, etc. If the rules changed and I had to do that, it would be a significant expense, reduce the value of my property, be a hardship if we decided to move into that space in old age. Ultimately, this whole thing seems absurd and silly to me. The city and Homestay Network did what you asked us to do. Bring us a proposal and we'll
Caller,
pass it.
you're at 3 minutes.
Yes, hi, Perry Martino here. What I had written you all is going to be different than what I'm going to speak to, because what I'm hearing, thankfully, is a little more open-minded and having a much more fair discussion than what I experienced in the past. I'm also one of those who are grandfathered, and I've been involved with the homestay since I purchased my home. I did purchase my home back in 2017, and part of that purchase was doing my due diligence during my real estate process to make sure I could have a homestay, because there was one already in place. So I did do my due diligence and received my own homestay permit. So I'm okay at the moment. But what truly baffles me is, because I mentioned, again, I've been at this since 2017, that we are here 2 years later discussing the same situations about sinks and stoves and refrigerators. I just want some of you to step back and put yourself in a position of one of us, the homeowners, that want to have family visit, friends visit, and when we're not, be able to have our short-term rental. And as we could see during the pandemic, life is not perfect. And somebody even used the phrase, we don't have a crystal ball. So we would like maybe a long-term rental occasionally. I would not have been renting. I did not rent during the pandemic. With that being said, I just want you to please step back, relook at all this, and let's not let this drag on. Let's make this decision, move forward to allow the full kitchen, and work with your people that pay the taxes here. The hotels have kitchens and stoves. Don't give us such a hard time, tax-paying residents. Thank you.
Afternoon, Council. My name is Ben Butler, and I live in the Wecan community here near downtown. While you guys are discussing sinks and long-term versus short-term housing, please keep the following in mind. Long-term and short-term rentals are not interchangeable. In the March PED meeting, Councilmember Turner mentioned several times her concern that any short-term rental unit is a lost long-term unit. If that were the case, Ms. Turner should be compelled by her convictions to convert her short-term rental into a long-term rental. Of course, I don't imagine she really feels this way because every rental unit and every rental owner is unique. And as a short-term rental owner, I introduce guests to Asheville's great neighborhoods as well as the town and what it offers. People who prefer long-term rentals prefer long, steady income and generally don't want to have as much interaction with renters. In my particular situation, I'd like to give you some numbers because we seem to be grasping for statistics, so I can only speak for myself. But I have two houses on Chicken Hill. I live in one with my wife, and in the second, 500 feet up the hill, I have a long-term renter who is a teacher in a small basement apartment that she can afford. She couldn't afford the rent on the upper part of the house based on what the market demands in this neighborhood. Because this person co-hosts the Airbnb with me, I pay her 10% of our gross rental fee revenue plus cleaning fees, and as a result, she's able to offset her rent. Last year, from May until December, she offset her rent by 70%. I'm willing to take this hit to my revenue because I do want to protect my neighborhood and our community. But what I find unacceptable is the broad strokes that Councilmember Turner paints of all short-term rentals. Regarding kitchens, the committee was so close to a fruitful discussion last week, and it sounds like you're moving in a good direction. Last month, Councilmember Kilgore raised concerns over sanitation related to the removal of kitchen sinks from short-term rental spaces. Unfortunately, she was overwhelmed by Councilmember Turner's explanation of why, in her case, the lack of a kitchen sink is just not a problem. I can't argue against her personal experience, but Ms. Turner's suggestion last month that I, like her, should simply install a larger sink in the bathroom of my STR is an unreasonable option for me, just as my suggestion that she set up a long-term rental in her space may not be practical for her. In my case, I can say that the idea of putting a kitchen sink in the bathroom 10 feet away from where the kitchen sink actually belongs seems like a foolish consistency to both me and my guests. Of our 45 reviews over the last year on our short-term rental, 8 of those reviews mentioned negatively the lack of a kitchen sink and 1 rated us down for it. A sink is a sanitation issue. It's unreasonable, unsanitary, and destructive to encourage renters to wash their coffee grounds and food waste down a smaller diameter bathroom sink with no food disposal when the space was built with the intention of having a full kitchen. It seems very obvious from the comments of staff last month that stripping a kitchen space of its function for an inspection hasn't eliminated the greater issue of absentee landlords. Please reconsider your positions on the kitchen requirements and recognize that if your goal is to encourage local participation in rentals, you're not doing that by having us take apart our kitchens. If you have any information or any questions for me, my contact information was included.
Caller ending in 9,000, your line is open.
Yes, good afternoon, Council. This is Christina Vare. I am a homeowner for the last 15 years in the Oakley neighborhood and joined the Homestay Network in 2020 in hopes of being able to offset the increasing expenses of updating and maintaining my home in the neighborhood. And of course, the increased taxes due to the desirability of owning a property in Asheville. I'm able to allow family members who are in the service sector and work in Asheville to live upstairs with the hopes of being able to have a homestay in the walkout basement of my property. I've been delayed in being able to do this in part because we have installed a wet bar sink, which does not fit the dimensions of what is currently allowable. It's really unfortunate to think that City Council takes the time to be able to come into my home and tell me what I can and cannot do as a tax-paying citizen for the last 15 years in the city of Asheville. Also, I think it's really important to recognize that that additional revenue that I would earn.
Inadequate kitchens on homestays helps create more affordable housing. I see it that it truly prevents them. If I can't have a sink in my efficiency kitchen area, then I can't switch to a long-term rental in 5 years, which is really what my plan is. I suspect I'm going to get tired of the day-to-day demands of running a homestay. So in this instance, Asheville will miss out on a chance to have one more comfortable, affordable home on the market. Anyway, a quickie. I'm sort of dumbfounded that Councilwoman Sage Turner refuses to recuse herself because in every governance situation with which I'm familiar.
This is Gwen Whistler.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Brad Branham to address that question relative to recusal. And so I'm sort of stepping out of what we normally do with public comment. And Jenna, if you could stop the clock on this, and then I'm going to ask the attorney to address this issue. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and can I finish my last few words?
Sure.
Okay, excellent. I just thank you for the opportunity to speak and to be heard. And I just thank you. And I thank you all for your work.
So Brad, if you, before we ask the next, can you address this issue? We've gotten a lot of comments that Councilwoman Turner, because she does operate a homestay, should recuse herself around this issue. And I know you've looked at it, and Councilwoman Turner has certainly taken the suggestion seriously and asked for your input. And if you could help give us some guidance on this.
Absolutely, Chairman Whistler. So what we have here is a situation which we must start from the basic rule in North Carolina found in General Statute 168-75, which requires all council members to vote, whether it is on the full council or on a committee, on all items, except for a very few set of circumstances where there are exemptions. So there is a general proposition that you must vote. Recusals are only in a rare circumstance. Now, for this particular item, this falls under a new set of legislations, which has been codified in the general statutes under Chapter 160D. And in 160D-109, you find the actual particular standard for a recusal for this type of a matter. And it essentially says that a recusal is only appropriate where the vote is likely to have a, quote, direct, substantial, and readily identifiable financial impact to the council member, end quote. Now, what that means in particular is, in this case, whether or not this moved forward would have to have not just an actual financial benefit, but a substantial one that is directly attributable to this particular legislative change. Now, because Councilwoman Turner's homestay is already in place, she'd be grandfathered in any change, which means this would not affect by limit or limiting her rules at all. And in fact, the possibility that competition would be decreased would be so difficult to ascertain any specific substantial benefit to her. It is my legal opinion that it does not rise to the level under the new general statutes adopted just this year by the legislature that would overcome the presumption to otherwise vote on all items before.
After getting a permit, deal with immediate noise complaints, or catch a host lying about living on the property once they get their permit. The city still has an enforcement role to play, and the staff proposals were designed to help with this. And a side comment regarding the fine discussion that was earlier put out was talking about increasing fines. And one of the, ultimate third strike thing was to revoke a permit. And I would just note that many of these people don't have permits that are out there. So finally, I would say that the redefined homestay ordinance recently proposed by staff as a result of years of work between the Homestay Network and other interest groups. And thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Sarah with Attached Units. Trying to you think your accomplice to our existing kitchen will likely not go back and forth between homes we're trying to solve. We're making housing in this city, including us, affordable homestay problem. Rather, it involves how things operate in the city. Perhaps requirements for houses so that developers can afford to build units without parking. Perhaps you can redirect tourism advertisement dollars to help subsidize affordable housing. Perhaps you can increase the nightly room taxes and direct those dollars into affordable housing projects like rent subsidies and affordable housing units. You are preying on the individual homestay hosts rather than going after the bigger fish that will bring affordable housing to our city. And most importantly, these arbitrary homestay rules aren't accomplishing what you want them to, but rather they're punishing the local entrepreneur resident who's trying to make their life affordable in this town. Homestay hosts are local entrepreneurs in the same way that restaurateurs and artists and tradespeople are. Why are we charged with solely carrying the burden of affordable housing? So please consider placing this responsibility on other aspects of our community and city planning, especially the aspects that can afford the burden, like tourism taxes, developer subsidies, etc. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
One second. I think we're having some issues with the speaker queue. Caller ending in 4121, your line is open.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good afternoon. This is Jackson Tierney. I had some prepared remarks, but I think my time is probably better spent responding to some of the discussion that followed Shannon Tuck's presentation. There are 4 items that I want to touch on briefly. I think when you had mentioned a study in Seattle, the city was actually Portland, and it's a very data-rich study, and I think is very instructive for what we can expect if we make more flexibility in Asheville. If you look at Portland, about 10 years ago, they were creating about 28 ADUs per year, and when they took the lid off and allowed people to use them for short-term rental, they found that more of them were being built, and they went from 28 a year to over 600 per year. So they built about 3,000 in the last 5 years. And the other thing that they studied very closely is the attrition rate of short-term hosts. And they found that 50% of the hosts give up housing clients. The last is in regards to the number of permit holders. There are 691 homestays. 68% have said that they have been negatively impacted by the kitchen rule. And in fact, 120 permit holders have given up their permit in the last year, mainly due to COVID, but also I've gotten lots of notes. People just are exhausted of being
Caller,
hosts.
you're
So
at 3 minutes.
And thank you very much for your time.
Hi, this is Nicholas DeMattis. I'm an Asheville resident for over 10 years. And I think it's weird that the city makes it sound like it's some sort of a privilege to be able to rent part of your home. If I'm renting out my basement or part of my home, whether it has a kitchen or suite later in life, and be making that addition if I wasn't able to rent it out short term. So I truly do believe by making these strong restrictions, you're limiting all rentals and not just long-term rentals or short-term rentals. So if you make the restrictions too much, I truly think you will put a limit on the long-term rentals that may have possibly been created. Thank you for listening.
To the council. I'm also not frankly clear on what the recommendation is from the city staff. Are they recommending the full, or are they just showing three options? Are they recommending the full kitchen? And the current regulations, which are a small fridge, a big sink, and no stove, don't seem to be on there at all. So again, I'm sort of confused about what is the committee being asked to evaluate. In my opinion, if the idea of limiting to one owner for homestays seems very likely to preserve the character of our neighborhoods, if that is one of the goals. And I know there's been a few different opinions about what the impact of permitting full kitchens would be, but it feels like in the long run, it is more likely to increase rental housing. I know that's my sister-in-law's plan. And I think we just heard some information from Portland that also supports that that is what has happened in the real world. So I thank you for your time. And just as an FYI, I think the video of this meeting stopped working about 15 minutes ago, both on YouTube and on the Asheville City feed. At least it did for me and for one other person I'm texting with. Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.
Can we pause and confirm that?
Yeah, let me check our live stream real quick.
Thank you. Thanks for letting us know, caller.
Okay, I think it did pause for a few minutes, but it looks like it's live now. So I'll go ahead and bring the next caller in.
Thank you, Jenna.
Hello, my name is Peter Cutler. I live in Candler, in the beautiful city limits of Asheville. I am a homestay host and wish to register my concern over the kitchen rule, obviously. The rule is an unnecessary imposition on tax-paying citizens. The fact that I have a kitchen in a rental space, or even if I don't, should not be legislated. I understand there's a need for affordable long-term housing. Everyone does. However, please understand that I am renting out a portion of my own home, and I'll always be extremely careful on who I choose to occupy that space. I do not want a long-term renter. The extra bedroom that I have in my house is not conducive to long-term renters. I will never take a risk on letting someone move in, trash the place, not pay rent, and then be told by a judge that the tenant has more rights than I do, and there's absolutely nothing I can do to evict them other than wait several months and lose countless dollars in the process. Hence, the short-term rental market is perfect for homeowners who do not want to take such risk and or want to enjoy periods of time without anyone in our homes, holidays, for instance. You have stated in this meeting that you have zero statistics on how many long-term rentals are eliminated by the presence of short-term rentals. I would like to submit it's not an all or nothing one-to-one ratio. Having a small kitchen affords us the opportunity to have homestay guests when convenient, or have family visit, or provide an affordable space for family members, or host long-term guests when we choose. Having to eliminate a kitchen just for the sake of eliminating a kitchen, that's ludicrous and it's a waste. In short, I appreciate your desire to increase the stock of affordable long-term housing, but the spare bedroom in my house is not the answer to the problem. And I believe if you legislate homestays to the point where people take their listing off of Airbnb, VRBO. Many will just find other ways to market with word of mouth advertising or friends of friends or whatever. This perhaps would reduce income, but it wouldn't deter the host. Some of fewer short-term rentals at a higher price would result in more income than a long-term would anyway. So many would just go that route. Some might shut down, but either way, the long-term problem will still exist. Thank you for your time.
Hello, my name is Michael Bunch. I'm a homestay host in the Kenilworth neighborhood for the last 6 years, I believe. We are grandfathered in, and our kitchen has a full-size sink and a full-size refrigerator. One of our concerns is that if we ever decide to sell our house, or if our permit lapses, then we wouldn't be able to do a short-term rental, or we would have to spend a considerable amount of money changing the kitchen, ripping things out, and that's a concern. That seems to be over our head. It's unsettling. Also, the increased value. Our house has increased its value having a small apartment downstairs, and that has raised, along with the value, it has also our property taxes are raised. Over the last 2 years, the property taxes have gone up 35%, which was shocking. It was actually all in one go. The property taxes just went straight up. And so having a short-term rental in our house, being, I work in the service industry here in Asheville, and having our short-term rental homestay is what keeps us in Kenilworth, in this neighborhood, which is very sought after and is, the housing is skyrocketing. Let's see. Oh, I was going to do a.
It seems like a very arbitrary thing to target. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Frank Manganaro, and I am a permitted homestay host. I work in education. I built out a portion of my home to create a short-term rental to help me afford to stay in my home. My taxes have increased almost 33%, and like the majority of Buncombe County folks, my house has just been reappraised, and most likely there will be another tax hike. Like the council, I do not want investors coming in and buying up properties and renting them out for short-term rentals. I also want Asheville to be a place with affordable housing. Just to know, the city of Asheville has one of the highest cost of living of all the cities in North Carolina. So that's just a reality here. I think it's the responsibility of the state and city governments to provide affordable housing in their jurisdictions. And that seems to be, happening with the Beaverview apartments that are going to be like refurbished or whatever. But it appears that these government entities are trying to blame a shortage of affordable housing on homeowners, with short-term rentals who are trying to just stay in their homes. I think pointing the blame is passing the buck. And it's just become kind of a, hyperbolic, like the sky is falling on affordable housing if we allow short-term rentals. That's true. I'm in favor of changing the city regulations to allow a regular size sink in the convenience bar, short-term rentals. I think it's very unsanitary that I have to have my guests wash their glasses and snack dishes in the bathroom sink, which is for personal hygiene, not for washing dishes. I'm asking the city to take a stand for its hardworking, tax-paying homeowners who are really the backbone of the city. Last year, both the Planning and Economic Development and the Planning and Zoning teams passed the proposal to change the rules by 3-0 and 5-0 votes. It was supposed to be brought to the council for discussion and vote this past January. So really for the city to take an about face on it now is like a slap in the face to its citizen homeowners. I'm just encouraging all the committees in the council to honor all the hard work that has been done on this proposal for the past several years and not throw it away just because we had a turnover of some council members. There has to be some continuity there. I would like the language of the proposed regulations to be put back to its original state on before it was changed.
Hello, this is Andy Brockmeyer. Thank you very much. When I was 8 years old, my mother bought a house with a detached garage apartment in Santa Fe, New Mexico. 40 years later, I look back and think what an incredible asset that tiny guest house was to her life and mine. When I was 12, my grandparents came to visit for a whole month one summer. Another summer, my aunt came to visit for a whole month. That was the longest time I ever got to spend with those relatives. Another time, my brother came home when he was going through a divorce and spent time. Another time, my sister came home to get her nursing degree and stayed in that guest house. It had its own kitchen, its own cooking facilities, its own bathroom. I met the most interesting people from all walks of life during my youth. She rented both long-term and short-term. Some of those people became lifelong friends of ours. Some of them would house sit for my mother or feed her animals so that she, in turn, could go travel. There was also a time when that little guest house was such an important part of my mother's life, as well as her personal economy. It helped her to pay the mortgage, gave her the versatility to have a flexible and colorful life. Even though she didn't have much money, she was a rock for her children and grandchildren. The reason I tell you these things is because America is about freedom and about property rights. If the city of Santa Fe had gotten off track like Asheville and adopted these Gestapo-like tracking and punitive techniques, then my mother would have never been able to have such a flexible and gracious life, allowing her to age in place. When she was 70, she moved from her big house into her tiny house, her garage apartment, and downsized. She had the options to have her family come and go, and it was a beautiful thing. The fact that the city of Asheville has been chasing its own tail, arguing about kitchen, no kitchen, short-term, long-term, sink or not sink, detached, attached, is just a waste of time. I've been waiting for 3 years to create my homestay. I can't wait to do it, but I'm at a stay under the same roof, share a kitchen, wash their dirty wine glasses and dirty plates in a bathroom sink does not show Asheville visitors our best, but rather shows them our worst. Surely we can be bigger and better. We are lucky. We live in a unique place, and we have this one opportunity to create a legacy where Asheville homeowners have the flexibility to do what they want with their house, pay their bills, use that money to send their kids to college, all from the possibility of renting out a bedroom, a basement, a garage apartment, and even an accessory structure, which is currently being considered to be stripped from the rights of the citizens of Asheville. Affordable housing is not about limiting people's options. Affordable housing is about creating more units for wealthy, units for middle class, and units for poor people. We have housing shortages throughout the spectrum. The only way to solve this is
3 minutes.
That create units wherever you can, especially when you.
That was our last caller.
Okay, I think at this point, staff would like some guidance, unless you all want to vote on it. So what I'm going to do is ask each of the council members to tell me where you stand on option 1, 2, or 3 relative to the kitchen. If we don't have consensus, then we'll go to a vote. So, Councilwoman Kilgore?
Okay, on the 1, 2, and 3 option for the sink and in the kitchen, I will say I'm really torn between the option 1, allowing the sink and the refrigerator or whatever, no stove, and part of me is still sort of the option 3 of allowing the full kitchen. So I would say that's sort of where I am between those. As far as the investor, I think we should just allow 1 homestay per resident. I think we need to go with that option.
Owner, you mean?
Per owner. Yes. So that's where I'm leaning on those. It's sort of, like I said, that's where I am. I'm not really,
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Councilwoman Turner?
Ms. Tuck, could you pull those up, please, that grid? So I make sure I'm answer to each of them. And Chair, you would like us to identify if we support or don't support each of these?
Right. I mean, what I'd like you to do is give me preference on 1, 2, or 3.
My preference is that I don't think we know enough to change the rules. I do agree that the 1 per rule may be beneficial. And I would request that when information comes to council, we get a little more detail on what that looks like. And
what looks like, Sage? What
the legality, what that might mean for people that currently have more, like Ms. Tuck said, that could be an impact where someone sees a loss, people that are already doing that. What that means for enforcement, and if the city staff feel that will help them in enforcement and how, and if that means we'll need more enforcement staff, et cetera. I just think there's a little more to that gelling there. But I do in general support the idea that we need to limit it to 1 owner or 1 per owner. And then
so wait, let's go back to the kitchen. Okay.
I personally don't support expanding short-term rentals until we have greater enforcement, greater understanding of the impact, and I hope we'll have these larger discussions at council around what it's doing to increasing housing costs and who it's impacting, et cetera. And I really appreciate everybody's input today. I know it's a really complicated issue.
Okay, but so you're just not.
I'm not supportive of expanding
So at this point, you would say number 2, don't allow any major kitchen elements. So no sink, no refrigerator, no stove.
I mean, unfortunately, what it currently exists is not one of these options, right?
No, that's what number 2.
They have this weird sink definition they can do, but yeah.
Well, Shannon, help us out here. I thought that number 2 is really where we're sitting right now.
Yeah, thank you. It is. Number 2 is meant to reflect today's options. So you heard reference in some of the callers about this like unusual sink, doing a custom sink that's unusually deep. So the definition today says a kitchen is anything that includes any one of the 3. And then it describes a full-size refrigerator, a stove, and then a sink of particular dimensions. And I explained last month that was meant to not preclude a lavatory sink or a utility sink. So it has this kind of weird dimensional requirements to it. But unfortunately, what's happened is people read that and they think they start a search for a sink that meets these weird dimensional requirements, but that's not what it was meant for. So if the preference was to keep the status quo, what we would recommend is just updating that part of the definition just to kind of clarify that particular point. It was not meant to kind of allow for really peculiar custom-made sinks. It was really just not to preclude those commonly found sinks.
Which we think there are how many, Chris? We don't have an accurate measure of those because we've not tracked that metric. But I would say, certainly less than 50.
And I also would vote yes to excluding detached accessory units from allowing them to be homestays. And I stake my decision on that relative to the fact that we spend a lot of time in the neighborhoods about the ability for people to actually build more of those accessory units. And specifically, the regulation said it was to be used for housing, not for short-term rentals. And I feel like if we would allow that now, we would be going back on a promise we made to neighborhoods. So that's one of the reasons that, for me, I vote that way. So if I'm hearing this correctly, we have consensus, 3 people consent and agree. And you know what? We'll take a vote on it relative to changing the rules around limiting ownership limiting homestay permits to one owner. Say that better for me, Shannon.
That the committee supports requiring that property owners who do not reside on the property to be a co-applicant for a homestay permit.
Yes, and that be limited to one.
Yeah,
well,
we already limited to one.
Yeah, you already limited to one. Okay, so I'm going to take a vote on that. Councilwoman Turner?
Aye.
Councilwoman Kilgore?
Aye.
And I'm an aye. Relative to the kitchen definition, apparently we do not have consensus around this. So what I'm hearing Councilwoman Kilgore say is she probably is either option number 1 or option number 3. Councilwoman Turner is for option number 2, and Councilwoman Whistler is, I think that Councilwoman Turner would say go ahead and tweak whatever, 1 or 2, going back to.
I'm just saying if you're saying we're supportive of what, and they would appreciate it having it on the screen, but yes. Leave as is, or like we did last time, say if it's an enforcement issue and it needs to be removed altogether. It's not in front of me, I'm sorry, but I can. Oh, okay, I'm sorry, no, again, so stick with 2.
Okay, so Councilwoman Turner is supportive of option number 2, and Councilwoman Whistler is in support of option number 3. And my thinking about that is I guess I've heard so much about enforcement that it's hard for me to go back to option number 1 because, we definitely heard people rolling their stove in and out. As soon as Chris left, they just roll that stove back in. But option number 2 for me, I just am not, I guess I am compelled by some of the arguments around flexibility relative to these spaces. And so I would be supportive of option number 3. So Shannon, I know that we need to bring this in front of council, and I trust that however that, I'm sorry, my husband's phone's going off, sorry. That you will present this, as that there really wasn't consensus around this issue. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so with that, I am going to adjourn the meeting unless anyone has any more comments.
Councilwoman Whistler, we need to open it up for general public comment.
Okay, then let's do it, Jenna. Do we have anybody in the queue?
There's one person circling. Let me see if they're trying to get in.
Okay, but again, since we already talked about short-term rentals, that they can talk about anything else they want to, but not that.
Hey, thank you. This is Michelle Smith, and I'd like to hear today or in council and from staff why it's okay for hotels to have full kitchens and not homeowners. And just to think, and that was one thing I didn't hear anyone respond to. So if there's thinking around that at some point, I'd appreciate hearing it. Thanks. I appreciate all the.
Thank you.
That was our only caller.
Okay, thanks, Jenna. I appreciate it. So I really appreciate all the input and all the good thinking that's been put in this. This is an incredibly difficult area. Since I've been on city council, 6 months don't go by without discussing this issue. Unfortunately, there's a lot of speculation around some of this and what the effects are. And it's just an area that it's just difficult to get, heavy duty data on things. And so we got to do the best we can. So with that, I am going to adjourn the meeting. See you next Tuesday, folks. Thank you. Thanks, staff, for all your hard work, always.